This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Clara Cook, and joining me today is my fellow co-host, Duncan Barrett. Hello, Duncan.
Hi, Clara. How are you?
I'm good. This week that we're going to be talking about possible choices, so we are not going to be playing a game of Would You Rather or deciding on what we're going to have for dinner. We're talking about the kind of choices between life and death, or choices where either outcome is potentially catastrophic or negative. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a particular impossible choice that's become internationally known both in our culture and also as a way of describing impossible choices, which is called Sophie's Choice. So Sophie's Choice, it was a book that was written by William Styron in 1979 and then was later made into a film in 1982 with Meryl Streep. And it tells the story of a young man called Stingo who becomes friends with a woman named Sophie and her lover Nathan. And Sophie is a World War II Holocaust survivor, who's a Polish woman, who when she was in Auschwitz, when she first entered the concentration camp, was forced to choose between two of her children. She was forced to decide which child lived and which child died. And unfortunately, despite the fact that she felt like she couldn't make this choice, she was forced into making it, and one of her children went off and was killed immediately, and the other one died later on. So she's racked with guilt by this choice, and she carries it around with her and doesn't really deal with it in a very good way.
Well, she lies about it. I suppose that's the thing. And I think there's a sense, certainly in the film, and I think this is there in the book as well, there's a sense that she's almost lying to herself as well, because there's a scene in the film which is quite well acted. I mean, the whole thing is, obviously it's Meryl Streep, it's going to be well acted, but, you know, it's kind of interesting. She's sort of it's like sort of peeling an onion, finding out what happened in this story, and it's only like at the very end of the story that we find out what the real choice was. But previously she's told sort of slightly different versions of what happened that are kind of revealing some information but holding other information back. And I think there's definitely that sense of, you know, not only is she racked with guilt, not only is she unable to kind of process this, she can't really admit it to anyone. And then she, you know, when she finally does admit it to someone at the very end of the story, spoiler alert, but we kind of spoiled what this story is about anyway, she goes and commits suicide the next day. So it's kind of, it's almost like that admission is something that she can't kind of, there's nothing past that, you know, that's the end of her story, is admitting what happened. And
Sophie's Choice has now become like a cultural reference for a difficult situation in which a person has to make a choice between two equally unbearable options that are going to have essentially two equally negative outcomes. And so you often see, well, not often, but you can hear people say, oh, it was a Sophie's Choice. And sometimes actually when you're reading the news, especially about things that are really, really upsetting and very difficult, like international peace processes or something like the environment, you know, it's a bit of a Sophie's Choice. Do we do this? Or, which is one choice which is going to be bad, or do we choose the other choice which is going to be bad? But it's not just choosing from an array of choices. It's normally choosing from just two scenarios, two situations, two children. And this actually relates very well to, well, a lot of the impossible choices that exist in Star Trek. And one in particular, recently in episode 6, I believe it is, of Discovery, called Lethe, or Lethe.
I was hoping Clara was going to resolve this, because Clara has a classics background, but apparently it still remains mysterious. But I'm going with Lethe. What are you going with?
Let's say Lethe. Which is, I think it's the term for like forgetfulness, really, isn't it?
It's a river in the Styx,
Yeah.
I think, isn't it? And this is from Virgil, actually, from the Aeneid. I think there's a scene in the Aeneid where the souls of the dead, basically, in order to be reincarnated in a new life, they have to drink from the Lethe, and then their memories are sort of wiped. Essentially, very Star Trek, really. They have their memories wiped, and then they can go off and, you know. And it's interesting, obviously, the episode Lethe was also the episode where Ash Tyler is brought onto the ship. And it's kind of curious, I think, to know whether the title of that episode is that a clue to what's going on with Ash, which obviously at that point was not particularly obvious. Was that a kind of early tease of what was going on there? Does it relate to the Sarek story? Because actually, interestingly, the Sarek story is quite unusual in that although it is all about a memory, and it is all about this shameful memory, and they talk about shame at the end of that episode. She says to him, "You're feeling shame," or whatever, and he then becomes all kind of closed off about it after that. But it's actually unusually for these Star Trek versions of the story. It's not a memory that he has repressed himself. It's not a memory that he is sort of personally unable to recall. It's a guilty secret. It's something that he's lying about. Just as in Sophie's case, in a way, there was one version of the story that had been presented outwardly, and then there was this kind of secret other version. So in a way, Sarek might want to forget. He might want to drink from that river, but actually he knows exactly what he did and what that meant.
Yeah, and I think in a way, Sophie's situation is a horrific one, and one that we wouldn't necessarily presume, what we wouldn't necessarily state is in any way the same kind of dilemma that Sarek has, because obviously he's not having to choose between which of his children will live or die. But Sophie's also, I mean, she was very guilty about it, and she's obviously, like you said, she's psychologically damaged by the situation and the decision, but she's being forced into making a choice that in any other situation, in any other world event, it's highly unlikely she'd ever be made to make that choice. I mean, we're talking about a horrific regime. We're talking about some of the worst crimes against humanity that like human beings have ever seen, and she's more mixed up in that, and so she's being asked to make a choice that would never normally occur. I feel Sarek's choice is possible choice is it's also the result of persecution and prejudice and discrimination, but it's a decision that it actually could happen more often than, say, for instance, someone having to choose between two of their children living or dying. And the big mistake that he makes is he doesn't tell Michael that he had to make this choice. He lets Michael go on to believe that she wasn't good enough to get into the Vulcan Expeditionary Force, in the Science Academy, Vulcan Science Academy, and he goes on to let her believe that she's inferior, and that psychologically impacts on her. And that's definitely the sign of a bad father.
Sarek is a terrible father. I mean, the more we find out about him, the worse his kind of credibility gets. I'd say he's up there with Worf. They're kind of vying for the title of who's the worst father in Star Trek.
I think Worf's worse, but
you think, well, maybe.
Worf's more absent.
Worf is more absent, that's true. But I mean, Sarek, playing some pretty awful games, really. But I mean, I think what's interesting is so the question that is posed to Sarek is totally objectionable and unreasonable. The Vulcan saying to him, well, you can choose one of your children. I mean, really, arguably, since Michael Burnham had actually already applied, maybe they should have, accepted her on that basis, and then that's hard luck for Spock. I suppose it's interesting, you're saying it's different. Of course, it's not as serious as Sophie's Choice, where literally one of them's going to live and one of them's going to die. And as you say, most people don't have to face that kind of decision. But people do have to face decisions where, for example, they can afford to send one child to the more expensive school, or they can afford certain benefits for one child, but not for both. And actually, in situations where, say, food is scarce or other resources are scarce, people do make these kind of decisions, probably not in quite such a stark way. But I came across a story, for example, when I was researching my book about the Channel Islands occupation, of a woman who had been, her daughter got extra rations as a child, basically. So she got slightly above the adult ration, which was standard for children. And because her mother was, very sick and short of food, she'd been giving her daughter's ration to the mother. And the mother was like in her 80s or something. And the doctor found out about it and was really angry with her and said, you can't do that. Your mother's had a long life. If she dies now, that's by the by. You can't take from your daughter and put her health at risk to help your mother, basically. And so she stopped doing it, and the grandmother died within a month or two as a result. But basically, as far as the doctor was concerned, that was, I mean, in that situation, I suppose most people, given the choice, of course, they would choose their children over their parents. But at the same time, it does show that there are situations where someone has limited resources and might be forced to make very tough decisions, neither outcome of which is really acceptable.
No, I agree with that. That's a good example, actually, because that does raise the question, should you choose, I mean, how far do the familial bonds go? I mean, should you be choosing your children over your parents? Should you be choosing your parents over your spouse? Or should you be choosing your spouse over your parents? That kind of thing. I think it does depend on the situation, it does depend on the person, but I think there's something very particular about someone having to a particular dilemma about someone having to choose between two children, because it's ingrained in us that we're not supposed to have favourites when it comes to our children. We're not supposed to favourite one child over another, and invariably, in lots of families, one parent does have a favourite child because that child resembles them more, or if they're not sure they like themselves so much, it resembles their partner more and they prefer the child's more like their partner. And in most families, at least the families I know, there's been cases of mild favouritism. In one family that I know, whose name I will not mention, there's been a case of and it's by this favouritism is extended onto the extended family, so one side of the family is favoured more than the other, and it was extreme favouritism between two sons, and it's definitely caused, I would say, a certain amount of psychological grief for many, many years, well into adulthood. So I actually think that Burnham has a very good cause for grievance against Sarek. Here is, I mean, I know that he does say that when they get back to Discovery, he sort of says, when they're in sickbay, he sort of says, technically we're not biologically related.
Which is, again, like one of his unspeakably awful things to say.
Yeah. And she does say,
she says, disavow the fact that he's been her father for her entire life.
Yeah, exactly, and raised her, and also moulded her to be like a human Vulcan. And she says a very good line, which I really liked, which she says, that's, you can do better. You can do better, and we'll have this conversation again. I'm not going to force you, but you can do better. Which you never hear Spock ever saying to his father.
No.
There's more like resentment there, maybe more anger, but you never hear Spock confronting his father and saying, like, I think you could behave better. I think you could be a better father in this situation. But moving on to the idea of blocking out the memory or the consequences of an impossible choice from your mind. You said that there was an episode of Voyager that was very similar to Sophie's choice, where the Doctor was forced to choose between two kind of impossible situations.
Yeah, so the episode Latent Image is the one in which basically the Doctor discovers that he's missing certain memories, essentially, that he's had his program's been tampered with, and it turns out, as they go through this whole sort of investigation, but it turns out basically that there was this situation sometime previously where he was in a kind of triage situation where he had two equally sick patients, one of which was Harry Kim, one of which was Ensign Jatal, I think is her name, some ensign that we'd never encountered before, clearly, and he chose to save Harry's life rather than the other ensign's life, and wasn't able to deal with the fact that he'd made this decision, because basically there was no medical reason, there was no practical reason, there was, as far as he was concerned, no real ethical reason to make that decision. I mean, I think it's interesting though, we sort of talk about we focus on the impossibility of the choice, but in a way, maybe we also need to think about why do people make the choice they do? I mean, why does Sarek choose Spock and not Michael Burnham? Especially when she's the one standing in front, well, not literally in front of him, but, standing the other side of the courtyard or whatever, waiting to hear. Why does Sophie save her son and not her daughter? In Sophie's choice, I don't think there's really any information as to why she chooses the child that she does. But she does, under duress, make that choice. She does sacrifice the little baby girl rather than the slightly older boy. I don't know if it's significant in both instances. It's the boy that's favoured over the girl, which, of course, traditionally in a lot of families is what happens, that male children are favoured and are treated differently. but it's kind of interesting. And with the Doctor, you know, he keeps saying, I had no reason to choose. Why did I choose Harry and not this other character? It's difficult for us as viewers because we know Harry's the main character. It's kind of obvious he's going to choose Harry. Also, the person assisting him is Tom Paris, who's Harry's best friend. I mean, if Ensign Jatal's, you know, fiance was the one goading him on, would that make a difference? Do you know what I mean? I mean, there must be all kinds of factors at play there. But it's kind of interesting. I was trying to look into this. I was looking up rules of triage and so on, which I don't know very much about. And maybe if one of our listeners has a medical background and can fill us in on this, I'd love to know what the answer is. But I couldn't find anywhere any information dealing with the situation where you have two patients who are equally sick, basically. You know, it is all about, like, well, if this person is more likely to die and this person's more likely to survive, and the chances that, you know, it's kind of weighing up different possibilities, and it is very kind of rational and cool and detached. But the fact is, doctors must have to make these kind of decisions all the time in some ways, and in a way it's surprising the Doctor has never been presented with this sort of classic scenario before and just had to make a choice on whatever basis. But yeah, you're right. So what happens in the episode that's quite interesting is, so a lot of it is about the kind of mental repercussions of it. So he basically has effectively a breakdown as a result of it. He can't get over this thing. He becomes kind of obsessed. He keeps going over, he becomes obsessed with the idea of choice, you know, saying, I could have done this, I could have done that. What should someone have for breakfast? You know, every choice that we make in life. That there's something kind of appalling, I suppose, about the freedom that we have as human beings to, or as holograms or whatever, to make choices in our lives. And it's, you know, it's kind of interesting. So we talked about, you know, Sophie and her situation. She became an alcoholic. She had a lot of sort of, you know, legacy of that as a result. Sarek, it just seemed to damage his relationships more than his own psyche in a sense, but obviously he was carrying a lot of guilt and shame around that. The Doctor had a kind of complete breakdown about it twice, and only the second time, that episode, they kind of help him through it. And interestingly, in the novel Mosaic, the Voyager novel, there's quite a similar storyline with Janeway, where the way it's told is she's faced with this impossible choice, and we don't, or rather we don't understand that that's what's happened, but we understand that something awful has happened to her, and she basically has suffers terrible depression for many months and can't get out of bed, and as a result, and it's only right at the end of the book that we kind of learn what it was that prompted that. So in all these stories, there's this kind of connection between this idea of the impossible choice, which is what Sarek calls it, and a kind of mental breakdown that ensues as a result, because we just can't rationalise that kind of ethical situation to be put in. Well,
I'd say in most choices, I mean, you've got to question what an impossible choice is. And so when preparing for this podcast, I started really thinking about what an impossible choice is, like the very nature of the idea of the scenario. And there are lots of different types of impossible choices. And I think one of the things that I thought was interesting about Latent Image is that at the very end, the Doctor starts talking about possibilities. And he says, well, there's an infinite number of possibilities. And is it an impossible choice because there are so many possible outcomes that you can't make an informed decision? I mean, that's one kind of impossible choice. There's the idea that an impossible choice is choosing between two equally difficult or distressing scenarios, like Sophie has. You know, I mean, Sophie doesn't have to think about all the possible outcomes. She knows the outcome is a child is going to die. It's that her choice is got two equally destructive outcomes. The Doctor, because it's science and it's medical, and because it's not just down to him choosing, it's also down to whether, you know, Harry Kim has more of a fever, or is in better shape than the other ensign, or the other ensign is slightly more damaged. And for him, there's like an infinite number of possibilities. So it's not that he knows for sure one of them's going to die. It's that he can't possibly predict how the situation is going to resolve itself. And so he makes the decision that he can at the time, but with a limited amount of information. And I guess that's what triaging is. They're looking at all the information. This patient has diabetes and high blood pressure, and so this patient is more at risk from dying sooner than this patient who may have diabetes but lower blood pressure. So we're going to operate on the higher blood pressure first. And so doctors very rarely are trying to make decisions without information. Even in severe emergencies, they're reeling off information to each other. You know, the first thing the paramedic does when it comes into an emergency room is reel off a list of information, because they want the doctor to be making as an informed choice as possible. Even if it's an impossible choice, it's slightly less impossible because it's informed. Whereas I don't think Sophie I mean, Sophie, there wasn't a variety of possibilities for Sophie. There was just really two. And
I suppose there's the third. I mean, the third option is to refuse to make the choice, and then both children are killed. And that's the thing is, I suppose, when we say these choices are impossible, obviously the reason they're traumatic is they're not impossible. It is possible to make these choices. Do you know what I mean? And that's what, in a way, that's what creates all this guilt and shame, is the fact that they discover. It's as if you're discovering that you're capable of something that morally you think you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be able to choose between two children, and yet somehow she does because she has to. And, I mean, it's a grotesque situation to be in. And in her case, it's really a kind of sadistic. It's the kind of, worst excesses of kind of Nazi cruelty that she's put in this situation. It's not someone with limited resources. It's not someone, who's only able to save one person. It's someone who's, it's almost a kind of sick mind game, basically. It's a kind of attack on her as a moral human being to make her do that. But at the same time, in a way, we call them impossible because we wish that it was impossible. But in these stories, what we have is actually someone does make these decisions. And it's interesting when Sarek says, he says, "You're asking me to make an impossible choice." And the Vulcan kind of looks at him and says, "Well, that doesn't sound very logical." He's basically, he's saying it's not true. You're deluding yourself. That's a human attitude to say that these choices are impossible. The rational approach is to say, the Vulcans, we have the needs of the many or whatever. There are principles by which sacrificing one set of people for the benefit of another is totally acceptable. And I suppose if it isn't the needs of the many and the one, if they're just, one and one, what do you do? Do you toss a coin? Do you try to come up with a basis? And I think the reason it's hard when they're both children is that those are like both trump cards. I mean, any other situation, if it was, your child and your parent, if it was your child and your partner, that the child is like the one that you're always going to save. Do you know what I mean? In a sense, most people are not going to sacrifice their child to save anyone. But if there's another, if they've got two children, then it creates a kind of like a sort of moral conflict because and this sort of goes back to the question of like being a good parent or whatever. And that is sort of the dilemma about favoritism and so on is, do you love your two children equally? Is there any kind of difference in how you feel about them? And, part of being a good parent, I suppose, is treating them equally and not showing that kind of behaviour, which is another reason why Sarek is just such a generally awful person.
So that kind of does lead to the question of, but I think I agree with some of what you say, but I also disagree with it as well. I think choosing between two children between which child will live or die, I think is an impossible choice that would be pretty universal for most human beings.
But I just mean, what do we mean by impossible? Because it's not literally impossible. Is it?
No,
she
does make the choice.
It's
like a no-win scenario.
Yeah.
It's impossible. It's seen as impossible because both outcomes are going to be equally devastating.
Yeah.
There's not going to be it's not. I mean, we'll go on to talk about this about impossible choices that are seen as impossible, but actually the person making them sees one of the scenarios as slightly more of a positive one. I always read it that Sophie chose her daughter. I mean, this is what I just thought was Sophie chose her daughter because she didn't think her daughter was likely to survive Auschwitz compared to her son. Her son was older, so maybe stronger. Maybe she did favour her son over her daughter. But I think in a split second, I just read it that she makes this split decision that she's been forced into, that she just like survival of the fittest. And I think she thinks that her son has a greater chance of surviving the Holocaust than her own daughter. Of course,
which would make that sort of a justifiable. If there's a rationale behind it, you can kind of.
It's still an emotionally impossible.
I mean, it's still emotionally impossible, but it's interesting because you say that, and I can see why you might. I kind of think, is that just because you want that to be the case? Watching it because it's so awful. I mean, it's traumatic film to watch.
Yeah.
It's a traumatic book to read. It's because it's so awful. And you shy away from that. And I suppose is there an element of kind of bargaining with it and trying to make sense of it? And I think it's kind of interesting. The book doesn't give us, and the film doesn't give us any information about that. why she makes. I mean, given that the whole thing is focused on this choice, we don't. And in some ways, Lethe doesn't even. I mean, it's. I sort of took it that maybe implied is the fact that yes, Sarek has brought up Michael Burnham, but she's not biologically his child, and that probably is something that would be quite common if someone has biological children, adopted children, they may not treat them entirely equally, and that maybe that was the reason that he chose Spock over her. And also because of a kind of Vulcan racism that, yes, he's trained her to be Vulcan, but she's not Vulcan, and ultimately he's going to give it to at least the half Vulcan because he's, but again, that's me. I don't think any of that is explicit in the episode. That's me kind of putting on my assumptions about why does he make that choice.
So I think the two big differences for me was that Sophie's choice seems like a much more universally impossible choice for most people, whereas Sarek's impossible choice, although it is a very difficult and unpleasant choice to make, and I think that most of us watching Star Trek Discovery would probably agree that the lead Vulcan in charge of the Vulcan Science Academy is like a xenophobic, like, nasty man. I could say something worse, but this podcast will be publicly broadcast. So, is the choice universally impossible? That's something that everyone would struggle with, or is it impossible because it's being struggled with by that particular character? So this, I think, and this choice is particularly difficult for Sarek because he's an unusual Vulcan. It wouldn't be difficult for any other Vulcan.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And the other Vulcan basically says you're acting like a human here,
yeah. But then he married a human, and he had a half-human son, and he adopted a human.
So he's obviously got some...
Yeah, and so
he's unusual in that respect,
Star Trek, is there any other choice which is impossible because of that individual, rather than impossible because it's like a universally seen impossible choice? If you see what I'm saying.
Well, I suppose arguably that's the situation with the Doctor in Latent Image as well, is that another Doctor might be able to just accept, I made that decision, I don't even know why I chose this patient rather than that patient, and as a human being you might, if you were in that situation, you might question it. Was it because this person reminded me of someone that I know? Was it because that person's partner was in the room? And you might just sort of force yourself to live with the fact that you made a decision that you can't really justify rationally, but that, you did have to do it, and that the end result was positive. One of the patients survived, and otherwise neither of them would have survived. I sort of wonder whether with Sarek, there's also the fact that, I think Lethe's a fantastic episode. It's the first episode of Discovery, and I like Discovery from the beginning, but it's the first one that I really loved, I think. It's the first one that kind of really grabbed me. And it was partly that moment, because I think it's very clever what it does, because it deals with this literally 50-year-old continuity question, which is what went wrong between Spock and Sarek. And we know that they have this very difficult relationship. We don't really fully understand what happened. They bring in this character, Michael Burnham. Everyone's sort of saying, what, she's Spock's sister? You can't just give Spock a sister. How do you make sense of that? And so instead of like having this kind of continuity problem that they have to sort of brush under the carpet, they've actually solved a continuity mystery in the most brilliant way, because it's completely believable that it suddenly, in like one line, it explains this mystery that we've not quite understood perfectly in terms of these people's personalities, in terms of Sarek, in terms of Spock. And it was, that was the first moment in Discovery where I literally, gasped out loud watching that, because I suddenly realised when he asked that question, it all falls into place, it all makes sense. And no one would have guessed that was the cause of that rift in that relationship and all that trouble. And suddenly you can kind of understand it. You can understand where Sarek's resentment comes from, because it's kind of misplaced guilt in a sense that he's directing at Spock. You can understand where all these difficult relationships come from. So I wonder whether part of it is, yes, you're right. Like any other Vulcan would have made that decision. So it's peculiar to Sarek that it's a difficult decision. And actually, it's not just that it's peculiar to Sarek as a character and as a person. It's peculiar to Sarek because it's Star Trek and we've been watching it for 50 years. And for that character, this choice makes so much, has so much meaning for the viewer in a way that it wouldn't, frankly, someone else in Discovery choosing which of their kids gets to go to a particular university, essentially. So what? But because we've got all this backstory and we've got all this context and we know how difficult Spock and Sarek's relationship is as a result, it gives that moment so much power.
So then I guess the question is, are impossible choices impossible because of our emotions in the choice? So, would anybody, if they entered into a concentration camp and there were two random children were dragged in front of them, or they were given, I don't know, a pot of money in a completely different situation, they were said, you have two children from a poor, ghettoized area and you can only send one child to a prestigious boarding school or whatever, and you've got this money, who are you going to give it to? Would those still be impossible choices, or is it because we know the children are our children, or the two people that we're trying to save on the operating table are our colleagues, they're part of our crew? I mean, is it the close connection to us as individuals is what makes the choice impossible, or there just some genuinely impossible choices? I'm thinking of like City on the Edge of Forever, as the original series episode, when Kirk has to choose to let Edith Keeler die. And that's a choice where he doesn't actually have to do something. He doesn't have to choose somebody. He has to just choose not to do something. But in that situation, I mean, do we care about Edith Keeler? I mean, I don't think we dislike her, but we only really care about her because Kirk's in love with her. And so is it the emotional connection that a person has to that person or this scenario or this outcome that makes the choice impossible? Is it the emotion is what I'm saying, or is it like is there a moral aspect to it?
I think it's sort of the classic scenario. It does have to have that personal relationship. Really, that's what gives the Sophie's Choice story so much power. That's what makes it so. I mean, in the context of Holocaust stories, which are replete with so many awful, moral abominations and terrible degrading treatment of people, it's something that even in that context is shockingly awful. Do you know what I mean? To make someone make a decision like that. And and apparently it is based on reported instances of things like that may well have happened. So it's not completely ficticious, and it's not completely
it's not remotely,
imaginary.
It's not remotely surprising.
It's not impossible that someone, as happens in this film, forces that decision. I mean, I think the story in Mosaic is quite interesting from that point of view, because again, it's about relationships. Basically, the situation, what happens in Mosaic, this is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read Mosaic, stop the podcast, go and read it, it's a good book. But what we discover is that So what happens to Janeway? She goes in the shuttlecraft with her fiancé and her father, and the shuttle crashes on this icy planet. And Janeway regains consciousness in the ice, but her father and her fiancé have both. The shuttle's gone under the sea and they've died. And there's this. It's quite interesting talking about memory, because she has this kind of confused understanding of what she's seeing and of what's going on. So she keeps focusing on this iceberg that she sees, and because she's a scientist, she keeps saying, why is there an iceberg? Icebergs are meant to be in the sea. We're not in the sea. I'm standing on land, I'm standing on frozen ground. And she can't quite put it all together. But she's had this awful experience. Her father's died. Her fiance's died. She's lost everyone, basically. And so she sinks into this terrible depression for many months and won't get out of bed, until in the end, her sister and her family kind of rouse her out of it, and she gets back to her old self and gets back into Starfleet and so on. But then she has this there's this theme that keeps coming up about this closed door. She keeps having this dream about a closed door. I mean, it's fairly it's not massively subtle symbolism, but there's a door to a room. She has to go in there, and she says she has to clean something out, and she doesn't know what's behind the door. And in the end, in this sort of modern day, because the way Mosaic works is it's like a series of flashbacks telling her whole life story interspersed with this present day story on Voyager in the Delta Quadrant. She suddenly gets to this point where she can open the door and find out what's inside. And the truth is that she has basically, a bit like what's happened to the Doctor in Latent Image, where his memories have been altered by other people. In her case, she's essentially created a false memory in order to protect herself, because what actually happened was, it wasn't just that it was this tragic situation, that they crashed and that the two people she cared about most drowned. Actually, she had the option to save one of them, but she wouldn't accept that she could only save one of them. She only had enough power in the transporter to beam one of them out, and she just was not willing to accept that. And so she kept trying to get more and more power. And then she did finally get enough power, and by the time she'd done it, the shuttlecraft had sunk, which was which was this thing that she kept thinking was an iceberg. Actually, she had this memory of seeing the shuttlecraft sinking, and she'd blocked it out and imagined that it was an iceberg. And so in that situation, her refusal to make the choice actually created the third awful scenario, which is both choices put together, which I suppose is what would have happened to Sophie if she hadn't chosen one of her children to be killed. They would have taken them both away. but so for Janeway, that's the really awful thing, is that she, you know, and there's a whole sort of paragraph about how could she, whichever choice she made, how would she live with it? You know, if she saved her fiance and her father died, she'd spend her whole marriage, you know, thinking I saved you and killed my father. If she saved the father and the fiance die, you know, that would be very difficult as well. So there's this kind of, whatever she chooses would be awful and unbearable. And in fact, what she does is kind of what you expect the Star Trek captain to do. You expect him to say, I refuse this. And there's an episode of the original series where Captain Kirk is given two, I think it's Operation Annihilate. Spock is arguing to do one thing, McCoy is arguing to do the other. Both of these options, they have terrible consequences. Neither of them is a good option. And he says, I don't accept these two choices. I want a third choice, you know, come up with something else, because I'm not doing either of these things. And that's sort of what you expect to be the kind of heroic Star Trek captain's attitude, in a way, to basically say, I don't accept your choice. I'm not going to play along with this. That's what Janeway does. And it gets both the people that she cares about most in the world killed. So it's kind of, which is a pretty dark and grim piece of backstory.
Well, it's impossible, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's actually a good point, because that's very much in Kirk's personality, and like what you said is what you expect from a starship captain, and that leads on to like the official impossible choice in Star Trek, which is the Kobayashi Maru test, which is an official sort of impossible choice, like a no-win scenario exercise designed to test cadets in like ethical decision making and the leadership. And part of the test teaches students to recognize the limits of their powers and what they decide to do in the face of that knowledge. And I guess in a way, what Janeway decides to do in the face of that knowledge, like, she doesn't really recognize the limit of her powers, does she? She thinks I can get out of this.
Somehow I'll make it work.
I can solve it.
Yeah.
But actually, there are cases in Star Trek and in space and in life generally where there is only so much you can do. You can't necessarily always bend the laws of physics. You can't, you know, magic some better scenario into being, when sometimes you're faced with two impossible outcomes. So the Kobayashi Maru test, which I'm sure most people know, is when you have the choice of entering the neutral zone to save a civilian ship that's in trouble. And if you enter the neutral zone, you can break the treaty and you can start a war. But if you don't, then the civilian ship will die. And in the case of Kirk, he actually reprograms the test so that there's a third scenario and he wins. And he's the only person to pass the test. But the whole point is the test is not supposed to be passed. It's supposed to show how you deal with overwhelming adversity, how you deal with death, how you deal with a no-win scenario. The interesting thing about the story of Mosaic is it's an impossible choice that is pushed upon Janeway through circumstances, as opposed to an impossible choice in Sophie's choice, which is pushed upon Sophie through people. Yeah. People are imposing, other human beings are imposing this impossible choice on Sophie. And that made me think a little bit about impossible choices that are pushed onto people by circumstances. It made me think about the Deep Space Nine episode, Children of Time. And I'm saying this with a smile on my face because it's like we were watching
it's such a knockabout, hilarious episode, isn't it?
I was watching it with my husband. I think it was on Saturday night, and he was, after it finished, he kind of fell asleep halfway through, and then he woke up as the credits were rolling, and he was like, "Man, that was awful." He just said, "This is a scenario." Like, my husband's not a huge Trekkie. He said, "This is a scenario that would never happen." And I was like, "Well, that's why they did it.
Yeah.
That's why they posed it. They wanted this impossible choice where you had to sacrifice a whole, like they say, it's like 8,000 people for the life of like one person, namely Kira, and the sort of personal lives of everyone else aboard the Defiant. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was there was a rather dodgy moral question at the heart of this episode, which I haven't really heard anyone address, which is that the scenario that the inhabitants of Gaia, which is the planet that the Defiant crash lands on and then founds a new civilization, the inhabitants of Gaia came up with the idea of solving this problem by creating duplicates, so I imagine like doppelgangers, of the crew of the Defiant, which doesn't actually address like the moral implications of grounding a whole bunch of people on a planet. Because so I imagine like the original Defiant crew would get to go back to Deep Space Nine and Kira would be saved. But the duplicates would end up crash landing on Gaia. But that still means there's a version of Kira somewhere that will die. There's a version of O'Brien somewhere that will suffer without his family.
Was it not a lie, though? I haven't seen that episode for a while.
Maybe it was a lie.
I thought it was a ruse. But I agree with you. Like, in principle, I sort of thought last time I watched it that it was an odd solution. You're right.
Originally, Sisko's in favour of it. Sisko's like, right, we'll do that. And I'm like, you're condemning like a duplicate version of yourself to live forever without Jake. I mean, like, that brings up a whole bunch of questions of whether or not, like, a copy of something is still as important and as worthy as the original of something. But that's another podcast. But
but at the same time, it is sort of, I mean, that is, in a Star Trek sense, I think that is often a way, that's seen as a way of solving these kind of impossible situations. I mean, if you think about Endgame, you kind of almost, I think throughout the whole of Voyager, if you think about like Caretaker and Endgame, there's this, and Night as well, which kind of picks up on this in the kind of middle of Voyager's run. There's this, the whole of Voyager is predicated on Janeway making maybe not an impossible choice, but a very controversial and difficult choice. You know, she's got, does she protect the Okampa? Does she do the right thing for these strangers, essentially, or does she do the right thing for her crew and take them home? And then for 7 years, we see the consequences of her making the choice for the strangers. And, you know, in Night, she's questioning it. Did I do the wrong thing? You know, is my first duty really to the people that I'm commanding and not to these other people? And then interestingly, in Endgame, you kind of get the same thing because you get these two, Admiral Janeway comes back and says, look, I've got a solution. You can do this thing. You can get home earlier. We can kind of cheat the system. Then there's the alternative is they can they can deal a blow to the Borg and not get home earlier. But what they end up being able to do is to do both. So because they've got two Janeways, they've got the old Janeway, the new Janeway, you know, one of them can carry through one plan, the other one can carry through the other. So it's almost the same thing. They kind of split the character and therefore they can do both scenarios at once and kind of save both of them. But obviously that's not really possible. That is a kind of sci-fi construct. I mean, I think Children of Time is an interesting one as well, because the sense I get watching that, and this is sort of leaving to one side the way that Odo behaves, but basically other than Odo, everyone else ultimately comes to the realization that there is no real choice. There's a moral choice and a selfish choice. You know, they're not kind of equal options for them to choose between. And I think that episode is quite interesting in that sense. There's this kind of very reluctant coming around to doing the right thing because it's going to cost them all a lot. You know, O'Brien's never going to see his wife again. You know, like you say, Sisko's never going to see his son again. Kira's going to have to die. She's going to have to sacrifice herself. But ultimately they're all willing to do that. And I think my favourite scene in that episode is basically where O'Brien starts to come around to it because he's been very resistant. He's been kind of putting up a wall and basically saying, I'm not going to engage with this community. This is not really real as far as I'm concerned. This is from a timeline that hasn't happened yet. These people don't exist. And then at a certain point, he kind of, he sort of opens like emotionally to them. Do you know what I mean? And he becomes invested. He empathizes with them, I suppose is what it is. And it's, you know, it's kind of interesting if you look at it in terms of ancestors and genealogy and that sort of thing. There have been studies done on the kind of the way that we relate to ancestors at different levels and also the way that we think about our future generations, which is relevant in terms of things like ecology and, you know, decisions that people make in terms of the planet and future generations and so on. And basically what they've discovered is that people can empathize maybe like 3 generations in either direction. And beyond that, it's all kind of abstract. And so I think that's sort of a big part of it and that's why these decisions have to be about family members. They have to be about immediate family members, you know, children, parents, spouses or whatever. Because once you get any further than that, we just don't seem to be able to empathize that if we do something now, it's going to affect someone in 300 years. Basically, we just don't care. And there's an interesting parallel with that, I think, in the episode A Matter of Time, which is one of those kind of classic impossible choices episodes where Picard has this choice. Does he do nothing and some people will die, or does he try something and potentially kill everyone, basically? And he's sort of wrestling with this dilemma. He asks the guy who claims to be a time traveler from the future, even though it turns out in the end he isn't. And he basically says, well, to me, it doesn't really matter. You know, all these people have been dead for hundreds of years. I don't care. Essentially. So I suppose there's that element of it is like, what's your if they're not emotionally connected to you because they're your children or whatever, do you like O'Brien? Do you kind of put up a wall? Do you decide that in order to make these decisions you have to not care about people? Or if you do care about them, how do you kind of reconcile that if you're going to make decisions that are having a terrible impact on them?
So in Children of Time, you're right about O'Brien. He does actually, I think, I can't exactly remember the exact quote, but he does say something like, I don't know these people yet. Or he says something like, I don't know I don't know this family. I don't know these people. I do know my family back on DS9. So you're right, it's his personal connection. He's not personally connected to the people on Gaia, even though they are directly his biological descendants. But there is something to be said, perhaps, I don't know if it's necessarily the case in all of Star Trek series, like amongst all aliens. I mean, I feel that the Klingons are much more connected to their ancestors and the descendants than the humans are. But I think this is a particularly human failing, and it's something that we encounter in real world at the moment to do with like things like climate change. You know, we can't. The average person on the street can't always think or imagine what climate change will look like, the effects climate change will look like, 1,000 years from now, or even just 100 years from now, because they know they won't be alive. It's hard for them to feel emotionally connected to it. It's hard for them to see that the decisions that they make now will affect people, generations to come.
And it's hard for them to care.
It's hard for them to care. But I feel that's a failing. I feel that's a human failing. I mean, I wonder if the Vulcans would be like that, or the Klingons, or perhaps maybe alien races that have more of a connection to their elders. Or, you think about like the Katras stored in on Vulcan, I think it's a Mount Celea.
Yeah.
The long history that Vulcan has of like devastation and war, and then there are adoption of logic, and Spock talks about that repeatedly in Star Trek, but he's talking about something that happened thousands and thousands of years before he was born, but it's still something that's kind of present in almost the Vulcan psyche. So I think this is a particularly human failing of the human race, really, to not see beyond their own kin and not to see beyond their own lifespan. It actually affects almost everything in our world, from the politics, the people that we elect to be our politicians, from the political decisions of our politicians, making decisions that will affect the next 5 years, but not seeing how this stuff will affect people 100 years from now. And one of the reasons why we live in relative prosperity in parts of the Western world is because our ancestors made better political decisions, or they tried to make changes to society or their civilization that would last beyond their own lifespans. So Children of Our Time is a weird example of that, like of them thinking beyond themselves, thinking generations beyond themselves.
But in a way, it's interesting because that's the very Starfleet thing to do. It's the right thing to do. We all know that the right thing to do is not to screw up the Earth for future generations, and to be responsible and so on, and to, treat the generations, 5 or 6 down the line the same way we would our children or our children's children. But that's what I think is quite interesting about the episode is really, it's sort of obvious what the morally right thing to do is, but they struggle to accept it because they have personal interests that conflicts with it. So there's this kind of real reluctance. It reminds me a bit of, do you watch Doctor Who?
Yeah.
The final David Tennant episode of Doctor Who, and there was this whole sort of mystery about how we knew he was going to die, and that someone will knock 4 times, and it was assumed the Master, because the Master had this knocking noise, was going to kill him. And in fact, what it was that killed him was that the silly old man got himself locked in the radiation tube or whatever, and the Doctor had to swap places with him and basically kill himself to save this silly old man. And I thought that was quite an interesting moment, because he has this sort of realization of, actually, it's a choice. He could just choose to let that silly old man die, basically. But he can't do that because he's the Doctor. He's a decent person. He knows he's not going to do that. But he has this real sort of pained look of kind of like, I'm going to have to kill myself now in order to do the right thing. And, and that's a real loss, and that's a real challenge. But at the same time, it's the right thing to do. And that, I suppose, is... it would be good if we had that attitude towards environmental issues or towards things that are going to affect other people, or that level of empathy for, people from other countries or people around the world or whatever. But I suppose that's the thing, is kind of being able to set your own self-interest aside and do the right thing when it's really not what you want to do.
I mean, that's very much a lot of what Star Trek's about. So one of the things that I thought was interesting to examine was like why impossible choices are such good drama when it comes to Star Trek. And I think for several reasons. I think space travel would throw up all sorts of difficult dilemmas and difficult situations that we haven't even thought about yet, just because space is an environment that human beings haven't naturally evolved. Other people may disagree with me. People haven't naturally evolved to exist in long term. Difficult choices provide good drama for an audience in terms of television, but also impossible choices allow the viewer to explore the true measure of a person's character. And that's something that Star Trek is all about, the true measure of a person's character. Not who you are just on a day-to-day basis, but who you are when pushed to the very limit of your existence. And a good example of this is the Wrath of Khan, and Spock making this decision at the end to sacrifice. Spoiler alert. But
I don't think we've ever had a spoiler alert.
If you haven't seen the Wrath of Khan, I think there's got to be something wrong with you people. But Spock makes this decision at the very end to sacrifice his life so that the Enterprise can escape the Genesis device and Khan without dying. And I see that as a very impossible choice, but I wonder if Spock does. Because actually, maybe it is an impossible choice for him. Maybe it's just, he seems very certain, the way he leaves the bridge, the way he makes his way down to engineering, like he knows that McCoy is trying to stop him. He's just very deliberate about it. I don't think it is an impossible choice for Spock. It's an impossible choice for Kirk, because he's going to lose his best friend. It's an impossible choice for the entire crew of the Enterprise, because they're going to lose their captain and their instructor, their beloved Vulcan, right? It's not an impossible choice for Spock. Spock is...
There's no way he's not going to do it. That's the thing. And he can rationalise it in terms of saying the needs of the many and so on. He can, he can justify it. He can sort of explain it in very cool terms. I mean, it's interesting, but it is very simple. But he is regretful about it, I suppose. And in fact, I don't know why I didn't think of this. That scene in Doctor Who is basically a rehash of the ending of the Wrath of Khan in a sense, because that's literally exactly what the Doctor is having to do. But it's interesting, isn't it? You say it's impossible for Kirk. Would Kirk have... I mean, in Next Generation, we have that episode where Deanna Troi is taking the bridge command. What's it called? The bridge test. It's basically the command test, and she can't work out what the solution to this problem is. And it turns out the solution, it's not the no-win scenario. It's not the Kobayashi Maru where she just has to accept that the Enterprise gets blown up or whatever. The answer is that she has to send Geordi, who is not only the chief engineer but her friend, to die in order to fix it. And it's not actually Geordi going on his own like Spock did and taking matters into his own hands or even volunteering. She has to tell him that that's what he's going to do. I mean, could Kirk ever have done that? Do you know what I mean? If for some reason Spock was the only one who could have fixed the thing in the Wrath of Khan, would Kirk have given that order? Because given that Kirk is the guy who doesn't accept the no-win scenario, who, like Janeway, refuses to make those kind of decisions, what would have happened? And would the ship have blown up? Because in some ways, is that a failure of command to refuse that? Or is that just very human to say, there are some decisions that I'm absolutely not going to take, no matter what happens as a result?
I don't think that Kirk would have ordered Spock to sacrifice his life, just because the next movie, The Search for Spock, Kirk doesn't sacrifice the life of an entire ship of cadets. The Enterprise is just a bridge crew at that point. But he does sacrifice a lot for Spock. He sacrifices his ship. Kind of inadvertently, not deliberately, obviously, but he sacrifices the life of his son. He sacrifices his career. He sacrifices the career of his entire bridge crew. And he does it to save Spock. And he does it because Spock is more important to him than all of that. This is kind of a little bit like Sisko not being willing initially in Children of Time to make an order, to deliver the order that Kira should die. Yeah. And he says, I don't have the right to do that. I will not order one of my crew members to die. And you could wonder a little bit. I mean, we don't really know what Captain Lorca's what he wants to do. We don't really know what his goal is in Discovery just yet. I suspect that he's slightly more nefarious than we're seeing so far. But he essentially is ordering Stamets to destruct himself. Yeah. every single time he orders them into the spore drive. And that's kind of something I couldn't imagine Kirk doing, couldn't imagine Sisko doing, couldn't imagine Picard doing. I could have kind of imagined Janeway doing it if she was really desperate, maybe Archer. But even then, you know, I mean, it's a captain, I think, in Star Trek isn't supposed to order their crew members on suicide missions. They're not supposed to order their crew members to knowingly and willingly, like, injure or hurt themselves, if that makes sense. So I don't think Kirk would have ordered Spock to kill himself or to die, like,
it's an interesting
the engines.
point. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, you know, you were saying he loses his ship, he loses his son. I mean, the losing the son is the most kind of, it is almost a Sophie's choice. He loses his son in order to save his friend, doesn't he? And you can almost, it's, I mean, actually, Captain Kirk, you kind of imagine if he was put in that situation, I wouldn't 100% be convinced he was going to choose to save his son rather than his friend in that scenario. Do you know what I mean? Which is, it goes against the kind of intuitive, what you would expect. But I mean, if you think of it that way, it is almost, it's not a Sophie's choice exactly, but it's the same kind of sacrifice being made. There's a kind of one for one, you know, these two people who are, I mean, I know he doesn't really have a relationship with his son, but on some level, notionally, they're the most important people to him. And he, you know, in order to gain back one of them, there's a cost, you know, which is a sort of theme that you often see with these, you know, if you kind of, I mean, because Spock is being resurrected, there's a kind of miraculous element to it. And when you have stories where something like that is being requested or is being engineered, there is often a cost to somewhere else. Do you know what I mean? What's the sacrifice going to be? I mean, we see that at the end of Deep Space Nine, there's this whole, the penance is going to be exacted and Sisko's going to be made to suffer because of, you know, begging for the prophets to solve, you know, basically a no-win scenario. Basically, he finds a way of cheating by just, you know, invoking a kind of Deus Ex Machina, essentially, and you know, doing it that way. But I mean, but it's kind of, yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe part of it is also what the kind of narrative expectations of these different series and these different films and so on are. Because when we say Kirk won't make a decision like that, but Janeway might if she's desperate enough, and Archer will. I mean, yeah, Archer is the captain who doesn't get to, you know, he gets the sort of Mosaic version of Captain Janeway rather than the Endgame version of Captain Janeway. He gets the situation where actually there isn't a third alternative. He keeps being put, you know, in season 3 of Enterprise, he keeps being put in these situations where the number of times that they say in that season, oh, we had no choice, we have to do this, or I don't have any choice, I'm going to have to do this. Having to do something that you know is morally wrong. And, you know, Sisko maybe had it once really in the pale moonlight. Archer sort of has it again and again and again. And understandably, it kind of affects him. I mean, he doesn't exactly have a breakdown. He doesn't have a kind of, you know, severe mental health episode as a result, but he, you know, by the end of that season, he's mentally in a very difficult place, you know, and he's got a lot of guilt and shame and all these kind of feelings that are associated with these impossible choices, that he is really struggling to deal with. He's not, you know, there's that line, isn't there, somewhere where he says, I want to go back to being, you know, the man I was before this happened, basically. And he's been kind of corrupted by it, by being put in these situations. It's affected him as a kind of human being, as a kind of moral person.
Are there any impossible choices in the new rebooted movies in the Kelvin timeline? Because I know that I know during Star Trek Into Darkness, Kirk sort of says, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but I know what I can do. I only know what I can do. When Spock's trying to advise him to not trust Khan and not do this risky endeavour of, you know, trying to board the ship, I cannot remember the name of it, the big dark, like, Section 31 dangerous ship. And I thought that was an interesting line. That seems like a very Kirk thing to say, and actually that's sometimes what people do say to themselves when they have to make impossible choices. You know, it's like taking the morality out of it. They're saying, you know, he sort of says, like, I don't know, I can't say what I'm supposed to do, but I know what I can. You know, I don't know what the right thing to do is in this situation, but I only know what my options available to me are, and I'm going to take them even if they're not the right things to do. And I wondered if that came up in the Kelvin timeline films, because our nature of what we think as moral decisions and the right choices to make and the wrong choices that we make have changed as Star Trek has developed. Do you see what I'm saying? So the idea of like morality in the original series in the 60s is slightly different than an impossible choice in the 60s. You know, Kirk having to choose between which red shirt person on a planet ends up dying versus Sarek having to choose between his two children in Discovery. If our ideas of what impossible choices are have changed over the last like 50 years of Star Trek.
Or is it just that our idea of what constitutes TV drama has changed? Do you know what I mean? And what we expect. You know, in some ways, Archer is not... You know, Archer is not a real person. Archer is put in situations that no other Star Trek captain has been put in, because at that point, when they were writing season 3 of Enterprise, they were trying to do something very different that hadn't been done in Star Trek before. And slightly, I mean, you know, we talk about Roddenberry's box, all the things that you're not allowed to do when you're writing Star Trek. You know, you're not allowed to have too much conflict, you're not allowed to have blah. And gradually, you know, after Gene Roddenberry died, well, and even before Gene Roddenberry died, to some extent, you know, people started kind of dismantling that and saying, well, actually, we think we can have this and we can have this and so on. And it's still Star Trek, even if we've got religion, even if we've got money, even if we've got whatever. But I mean, then there is the danger. I mean, there was quite an interesting episode of From There to Here where Sue Kissenweather, I think, was saying this about the episode Damage, the Enterprise episode where Archer steals the warp coils. And her take on it was basically this just, you know, whether it works or not, it didn't feel like Star Trek to her. She just felt like the story is fine, but there's something missing for it to be Star Trek. There's got to be a consequence, or there's got to be a kind of resolution. There's something absent from that story. And I think that's the sort of territory that Enterprise veered into in that third season. I mean, I really like the third season of Enterprise. I think it's probably my favourite. But I do understand why some people felt that it was missing some kind of moral grounding, really, that we expect. And in the end, they sort of get it back by the end of that season. But there's a long period where it sort of feels like they're kind of murkily feeling around in this kind of moral void, in a sense. A bit like, actually, talking about voids, you know, the Voyager episode, the void is kind of the same thing. It's the area of space where there's no kind of ethical behaviour, and suddenly there's this question. And that's, you know, there's Janeway faced with a very difficult, if not impossible, choice again. Does she abandon her principles? Does she, you know, do the self-interested thing rather than the Starfleet thing?
Well, before we go, I wanted to ask you, are there any impossible choices in Star Trek that are impossible because you have to choose between two very good things? Or two very good outcomes, as opposed to Sophie's choice, which is obviously, there's nothing good about it.
That's a good question. Can you think of any?
I mean, not really, no. I mean, I guess maybe Troy has to choose between Riker and, like, Worf. I mean... I
think one of those is definitely better than the other.
I mean, oh yeah, well, yes, I would, obviously.
No, I take your point.
But do you see what I'm saying? Like, as in...
Which is more like, realistically, is more like the situation that people have in life where they have difficult decisions to make.
You've got two very good job offers.
Exactly, yeah. Which one do you take? I don't know, yeah. Well, I suppose Riker has the choice between, does he go and take a ship of his own, or does he stay on the Enterprise, which is the best ship in the fleet, not in command? I guess something like that, maybe. But they don't feel as weighty. They're kind of, they're smaller, they're more relatable choices like that, because they're not, life and death. They're not, I mean, the situation, Sophie's choice, the situation in all these stories is very dramatic and very, the stakes are extremely high. But it's interesting, I mean, when we talk about these kind of scenarios, these kind of weird questions, I do think there's something about the idea of extreme choices that if it's not tragic, we actually find it quite funny. I mean, I'm thinking about, for example, I don't know if you've ever listened to Richard Herring's interview podcast where he has this podcast called the Leicester Square Theatre podcast. He interviews comedians, and he has what he calls emergency questions, which are basically the same questions he asks everyone. And the sort of joke is that he uses these questions when the interview is going badly and he can't think of anything to ask them. But most of them are things like, he has one, would you rather have a hand made of ham or an armpit that will dispense sun cream? So they're absurd questions, but you have to choose one or the other, and neither of those is particularly bad. They're not, but they are in that kind of realm of like, would you rather questions.
Yeah.
And people are fascinated by would you rather questions. People, people love them, I suppose, because they feel that it's almost like a game. Yeah. It's like it's a strange game. I have a slightly ambivalent relationship to them. I had a girlfriend who asked obsessive would you rather questions, and at first I thought it was quite kind of charming, and it got to a point where it actually really annoyed me, and I was like, I don't want to make these bloody decisions anymore.
Why do you make me decide?
Why do I have to decide about these absurd things, But I think there is something about, thinking back to the Doctor in Latent Image and the fact that he is sort of existentially troubled by this decision. And there's this kind of, he talks this stuff about quantum physics. It becomes almost like sort of Schrodinger's cat experiment or something. You do this thing, do you do that thing? Maybe it is something that, because human beings are aware that we make choices in a way that, other animals make choices, but they maybe don't think about it, and they don't suffer guilt and shame, and they don't, there aren't all these mental consequences, that maybe being a kind of choosing species and having this idea that we control our own lives and we control our own destinies. We're not even say like the ancient Greeks or something, some society that believes in fate, and you don't believe that you have such autonomy. For the most part, we do believe that we have essentially autonomy in our lives to make our own decisions, to make our own choices. And certainly in Star Trek, that kind of radical autonomy is the kind of, that's the Starfleet captain is kind of the emblem of that. They've got their own ship, they've got their ability to go out and do what they want, to do the right thing, to make the tough decisions, but with that comes this kind of awesome responsibility, I suppose, and the potential for these kind of second guessing yourself or doubting your decisions, or, struggling to deal emotionally with decisions where, where there wasn't a good outcome really, and you just picked the least worst one.
I think until recently that was something that was actually very American culture-wise. I'm thinking of a particular person, a judge actually, called Leonard Hand, who was an American judge who swore a whole bunch of refugees after World War II, well, actually during World War II, swore a whole bunch of refugees into American citizenship. And he did like a mass swearing in. And so there's a whole crowds of people who are all going to become American citizens there and then. And he made a big speech where he said, being American means never believing you're always right. Questioning your motives, questioning your decisions. I mean, he didn't say question your motives, question your decisions. I'm paraphrasing. But I actually think, and obviously Star Trek is an American show. It's produced in America and written by Americans and directed by Americans. And it's more international now, I know, but it was traditionally American cultural artifact, I suppose. And so that's something that I think is reflected, is never assuming you're always right, questioning your decisions. And Impossible Choices is all about you questioning how you make the decision, what you're going to say, what you're going to do, what decision you're going to make, and then dealing with the consequences and the repercussions of that decision. If you are required to make an impossible choice about which podcast to listen to, I can safely say right now, we can make that choice for you. That choice can be taken away from you. It's okay. It's fine.
But you can cheat and listen to as many as you like. So.
But I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you, Duncan, for talking to me about impossible choices.
My pleasure.
If you have any thing that you'd like to say, or anything you'd like to comment on this podcast about impossible choices, and you yourself have had to make an impossible choice in space recently, or about what to eat for dinner, or if you'd had to choose between two children, maybe you best keep that to yourself.
That could be one for one of Amy's shows, I think.
But it's been a pleasure having you all with us today. And it's been fun talking about talking about impossible choices, about Sophie's choice. But this isn't the only thing that we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things that you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, Warp 5.
Like, Mario is not a good person, and I don't like him. But when he openly mistreats Luigi is when I hate him. Is when I make the decision, I don't want him to make it through this. I don't want him to make it to the end at all.
The Orb.
That blanket really helped the show because it didn't end up turning into what Voyager did, which is we got to launch a network. This has to be this. It has to be put in a box that we can't get out of, Like Deep Space Nine takes the box, crumples it up, and throws it in the corner.
The 602 Club.
I love it. Have I said that enough? I think I said earlier that I was waiting to get to Timothy Dalton. Not to knock on Roger Moore, but I didn't like Roger Moore as much as I liked Dalton, and then Connery, and then Craig.
The Ready Room.
Since early 92, I was lucky enough to get the contract to do the companion for Next Generation. Went out for a week to LA when DS9 was still very, very secret. And my first glimpse of DS9 was knowing that they were working on it. And, like the script was being passed around in unmarked envelopes between the offices.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM, that's patreon.com/TrekFM, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.